The United States of America no longer has a viable two-party system. Yes, we still have two major political parties, but they don't reside at either end of the political spectrum anymore, which is the issue. To have a viable major two-party system, you need one party on the conservative end of the spectrum and one party on the liberal end of the spectrum. And we don't have that anymore. How did we get here? Let's talk about it.
It's gonna get better.
You've reached critical complacency.
The problem with discussing American political history, especially from the 20th century on, is that people focus too much on the flip that happened with the Civil Rights Movement, where people talk about the Republican Party and the Democratic Party kind of switching sides because of the Civil Rights Movement. Now, that's not entirely accurate, because switching sides would mean that the parties flipped their policy decisions, their platforms, and that never occurred. That just never happened. So obviously there was no switching in any real sense of the word. What happened was people aligned their social values more with one party or the other, depending on how they felt about civil rights. So you had people like Strom Thurmond, who were Democrats, who were deeply against integration and deeply for segregation and against civil rights, and therefore branched off and formed the Dixiecrats before just outright joining the Republican Party. But the parties themselves, there was never any real switch there, because the switches that happen with political parties happen gradually over several decades, and they have always happened and will unfortunately continue to happen. That's just how the evolution of political parties work. And right now, we are at the worst possible evolutionary stage of political change we have ever been in. If you look at the two main political parties in the United States of America right now, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and you agree to a starting point of roughly when Abraham Lincoln was elected, and you can say, okay, that's the start for the Republican Party. So let's go from there. And if you start there, then the Republican Party is obviously the progressive party. They're the party of equal rights. They're the party of abolition. Even though they weren't literally or strictly a party of abolition, it would be the party that an abolitionist would be a part of. They would be a part of the Republican Party, because that was the progressive civil rights party. By the time you get to the late 19th century, the Whigs, who were no longer a viable party, had taken over much of the Republican Party. Now the Whigs were a much more business-minded, corporate-minded party, and it was their values that quickly established themselves within the Republican Party. In fact, when Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president through a compromise with contested votes in Congress, a part of that compromise was that he would pretty much end Reconstruction because it wasn't good for business. Nothing to do with progressivism, nothing to do with civil rights, nothing to do with equal rights, everything to do with business. Everything to do with, well, I think it's just better for business if we end this right now, and then, Jim Crow can just take over in the South, and we can get back to making a buck in this country and not worrying about all this civil rights stuff anymore. Now, that doesn't mean the parties flipped. What it means is that the Republican Party became a far more business-minded party by the late 19th century and a far less progressive party. But there were still progressives in it, so that even though by the time you get to William McKinley and you've got a deeply business-entrenched Republican Party, you still have progressives like Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt was he was the last real true progressive of the Republican Party. The reason that Teddy Roosevelt and his cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt were of two different parties is not because they felt two different ways about the way society works or the way policy should be enacted. It's because they were in different times. If FDR had been of the same age as Teddy Roosevelt, he would have been a Republican. If Teddy Roosevelt had been born years later in the same era that FDR was, he would have been a Democrat. They were aligned on progressive ideas, but the parties had shifted between 1900 and 1932. And again, the shift wasn't this clean flip. Rather, it was a gradual progression from the business interests of the Whigs infiltrating the Republican Party to the progressive interests of the William Jennings Bryan figures infiltrating the Democratic Party. By the time you get to Teddy Roosevelt running as a third party, progressive with the Bull Moose Party, he is far more opposed to William Howard Taft running on the Republican ticket than he is to Woodrow Wilson running on the Democratic ticket. Because again, his party, his Republican Party, he felt had left progressivism behind and had become an almost entirely business-oriented party. Problem is that Woodrow Wilson was quite possibly the worst possible example of a progressive you could ever get for the Democratic Party. Now, after Wilson, you got Harding and Coolidge and Hoover. And again, the business interests of the Republican Party was the main thing. They truly were a conservative party, and they were opposed by a truly liberal Democratic Party, which is why the political era between 1932, say, 28, with Hoover coming in, say, I would say 28 to 32, and 1980 or so, was probably the best era for American politics being completely viable two-party system, where you had two fully formed opposing parties. You had a conservative party and you had a liberal party. And they would then compromise on bills and on policies to get a little bit for each side so that things could move forward. This is probably the greatest era of American politics because you had two really solidified conservative liberal parties. And then that started to go away too. And it didn't start to go away with the whole civil rights flip. That was just a social aspect of it all. That was just people who were aligning their social belief systems with one party over the other. Every election you hear people talking about how these idiots voting this way are voting against their own interests. But the fact is, everyone to some degree is voting against their interests no matter who they're voting for, because unless you're a special, unique miracle of a person that I've never personally met, I don't know anyone who has ever voted for a political candidate because they believe every single thing the party represents. They might totally believe in and love that candidate they're voting for, but nobody is voting for the Democrat or the Republican because they are 100% behind every single thing that those two parties take part in. So at some point, you're going to be voting against yourself. You're going to be voting against, say, maybe some of your financial interests because these social policies mean more to you. Most of the people who generationally were Democrats in the Deep South started to vote against their interests economically because their social interests were considered more important to them. It doesn't make a lot of sense to vote against yourself economically, so I think a lot of us have a hard time understanding why would losing your job and losing your farm and losing everything you have be less important to you than keeping this particular person out of your backyard. That seems odd. Wouldn't you rather have the backyard for them to be in than lose it entirely? And it was that social interest area that really started to screw with the American two-party system, because both parties reacted to it, and they reacted to it very differently, and both of them fumbled the balls in extremely bad ways. To understand where it all kind of started, you really have to go to the 1970s. You've got to go to the Watergate hearings and Richard Nixon's presidency. It was during this time that Roger Ailes, who was an advisor to Nixon, a media advisor, said to Nixon that, if if we had had a real strong right-wing news organization out there, you wouldn't have to worry about this Watergate thing. Now, that's important because, and I can't stress this enough, Roger Ailes was an idiot. Roger Ailes was one of the dumbest human beings that's probably ever been in the public eye. This was an astonishingly stupid man. Roger Ailes saw left-wing conspiracy everywhere he looked. And if you really want one person to blame for the absolute shit show that has become the American media system, people, it's him. Roger Ailes was the CEO, made the CEO by Rupert Murdoch of Fox News in the late 1990s. But you know what he did before that? He created the America Talking Network, which became MSNBC. He was also involved with CNBC. So wrap your head around that. Roger Ailes is responsible, essentially, for MSNBC and Fox News. If there's anyone who deserves the Let's Burn the Whole World to the Ground award, it's Roger Ailes. He's the one that did it all. So the problem is that Roger Ailes and his ilk saw conspiracy everywhere they looked. Everything they heard, every report they saw, they thought to themselves, hey, that seems like it's biased, even though it wasn't. But again, he was really dumb. And he then became an advisor to Ronald Reagan. And when he became an advisor to Ronald Reagan and started whispering in Ronald Reagan's ears, Ronald Reagan decided, yeah, you're right. You know, if we could just get rid of all this fairness doctrine stuff, maybe we could get some good news out there. At this point, the right-wing media, or the so-called right-wing media, really started to grow in power and reach. And this is when the two parties started to really fall apart. Now, back when I was but a young wee lad, I was living at home with my parents because I was young and in school, and I was working this crappy hourly job at an auto processing center. Bill Clinton had just been elected president for the first time, and to make sure we all understand where I'm coming from, I was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina. And if you haven't been keeping up, South Carolina's pretty deeply red. It's a really red state. Really red. And it was in 1992 as well. So, when I would get up in the morning and sit down at the breakfast table with my dad and my mom, I would read the Charleston Post and Courier, which was the pretty hard right-wing slanted major newspaper of Charleston. And on their op-ed page was almost entirely and almost always just conservatives. Cal Thomas and Charles Krauthammer, and Paul Greenberg and George Will, and so on. It was always right-wing op-ed pieces on the op-ed page. The day after Bill Clinton's inauguration, I, of course, sat down with my mom and my dad and had my coffee and was reading the op-ed page, and there were op-eds in there by, I believe one of them was Paul Greenberg, and I know the other one was George Will. And both of them were in complete agreement about Bill Clinton's inaugural address. The reason they were in complete agreement is because both of them were actual conservatives. Actual conservatives. Henry Cabot Lodge, Nelson Rockefeller, conservatives. And both of them reacted the same way. Both of them talked about how Bill Clinton had given one of the most conservative inaugural addresses they had heard in a long time. They both made comments about how it was more conservative than anything George H.W. Bush had said in his January 1989 inaugural address. He was clearly making an attempt to brazenly reach across the aisle and say, see, I'm pretty conservative myself, guys. And again, the reason they said this and the reason they wrote this and the reason they saw this is because they were conservatives and they knew what they were listening to. Then I went into work. Now again, I was in Charleston, South Carolina. And it was an auto processing center where I would spray a weird chemical mixture on the cars coming in to clean them and then drive them around to get their alarms and stereos installed. And when I was in the mechanics section, they always had the radio on. And yeah, they were always listening to Rush Limbaugh. And boy, shock of all shocks, wouldn't you guess it, when I listened to Rush Limbaugh, I had to stop myself from bursting into laughter at what I was hearing. Because Rush Limbaugh was saying this: "My friends, I can't even believe what I heard yesterday. I can't even believe it. An American president giving a communist, socialist, Marxist address to the nation. I couldn't believe my ears. I was so ashamed. I was absolutely ashamed. I saw this commie pinko Marxist up there just going on, and I thought, wow, you're dumb. You are really dumb." This guy gave a pretty centrist to conservative address, and all you saw was commie Marxist pinko propaganda. Now, there was a time early on when I thought maybe he was just running a grift. Maybe he was just exploiting the idiocy and stupidity of people who don't really understand or think about politics in any real way. But over the years, it became clear that no, he was just dumb. And that was the problem, and that remains the problem. He was the kind of person like Roger Ailes who didn't understand what conservatism was, and he didn't understand what liberalism was. All he understood was Democrat means bad, Republican means good. That's it. That's all he understood. That was it. He didn't think about it on any deeper a level than that. Shortly following the election of Bill Clinton, you got the 1994 contract with America, courtesy of Newt Gingrich, who is also on about the same intellectual level as Rush Limbaugh. If you ever want to have a conversation at a deeper intellectual level than favorite flavors of bubblegum, this probably ain't your go-to guy. Because old Newt understood politics about as well as Rush, who understood them about as well as Roger Ailes. And the problem is, Newt's side won. And on the Democratic side, Bill Clinton's side won. The Democratic Party basically continued a shift towards a centrist platform, and the Republican Party continued a shift towards a reactionary platform. Because there has never been anything really conservative about Newt Gingrich or Rush Limbaugh, and there was never anything really liberal about Bill Clinton. In fact, if you want to gauge how intelligent about politics the person you're speaking to is, ask them if they think Bill Clinton was a liberal, a centrist, or a conservative. And if they say, oh, he was a left-wing pinko, just erupt into laughter. People who talk about the Clintons as being anything other than centrist, fence-sitting opportunists have clearly not been paying attention. And yet, on major right-wing reactionary news outlets, you will constantly hear them referred to as the absolute boogeymen of the Democratic Party, even though in almost any other era I can think of, the Clintons would have absolutely been on the Republican side of the camp. Same, by the way, goes for Barack Obama, probably the best friend American banks ever had. Barack Obama was, like the Clintons before him, a complete centrist. Anyone telling you that he was a lefty socialist is just announcing to you that they're an idiot, that they have never, ever paid attention to what politics really is, to what political labels really mean, to anything. I mean, obviously don't try engaging them on like the philosophical ramblings of Edmund Burke, obviously, but don't even try to talk to them about who they voted for in the last election. These are seriously stupid people. Anyone who thinks that the Clintons or Obamas are leftist, holy Christ, you're dumb. And the last two conservative candidates to run for president were probably John McCain and Mitt Romney. And I think that's the end for the Republican Party. I would honestly say that right now we are in a situation where the centrist, mishmash, wishy-washy side has won the Democratic Party, and the reactionary populist side has won the Republican Party. We do not have a conservative Republican Party anymore, and we do not have a liberal Democratic Party anymore. If the only progressive policies that you hear about are coming from Bernie Sanders, a Democratic socialist who only caucuses with the Democratic Party, or AOC, then guess what? That's indicative of the fact that the Democratic Party is not a left-wing party. It's a centrist party that leans to the left. But that's not what you need in a viable two-party system. What you need in a viable two-party system is a left wing and a right wing. And right now we have a centrist wing and a reactionary wing. Will America ever be able to get out of this sand trap that we are now in? I don't know. I really don't. Because if you watch my first video on the crisis of stupidity and how the problem is, in fact, that people cannot discern good information from bad information, it just leads to the pessimistic outlook that there's nothing we can do. Because bad information is what a populist reactionary movement relies on. It relies on people not being able to discern what's good from what's bad. And you fight against that with truth and facts and an opposing political stance. And centrism is not an opposing political stance to anything. It's nothing. It's why the Democratic Party right now is so useless. Seriously. The Democratic Party is lost. But more importantly, America's lost. We've all lost. We've lost because we've lost the two-party system that made America work so well. We lost the two-party system that we had for a good 40 to 50 years of the 20th century, where we had a solid conservative right wing and a solidly liberal left wing. And they actually got things done because one side advocated for this and the other side advocated for that, and they came together and they took a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and they just kept going forward. Then the dummies came along, the Ailes and the Limbaughs and the Gingriches. And the centrist opportunists came along, like the Clintons and the Obamas. And look where it has gotten us. Look where we are now. We need a two-party system in this country again. We need to tear the Republican Party down to the ground and start over, and tear the Democratic Party to the ground and start over. Since political parties resist radical change, again, think about everything I've just talked about happening with the Republican Party. I started with Roger Ailes and Nixon in the 70s. Guys, that's 50 years ago, which is why, even though I know this will never work and it will never get off the ground, I feel like the only real solution is just two brand new parties. Like, just let the Republican and the Democratic parties die and start over. Political parties have died before. From the Republican Democrats to the Federalists to the Whigs, political parties have gone away and been replaced. Just because we've had the present-day Republican-Democratic binary since the late 19th century doesn't mean it always has to be the case, but it probably will be. Which means we're looking at another 30 to 40 to 50 years before we get everything back in order again. Great. Fantastic. See you on the other side when we're all 100 years old or dead. Thanks for watching. Bye.